Folks, it's 12:03. Why don't we go ahead and get started? Appreciate everybody being here today. I'm Bill Sproul. I'm the CEO of the Richardson Chamber and Tech Titans, and I want to welcome our audience today to our Texas Legislative Recap session. I am really pleased to have two colleagues and friends of mine who know the legislature in and out, worked hard at it. Drew Campbell of Capital Insights. I just, before we started, he told me that this had been his 21st legislative session to work, and he will be on his 16th special session coming up. So he's had a lot of experience in the state capitol, knows the ins and outs of it. He's with Capital Insights, and he used to be the CEO of the, I guess it was the New Car Dealers Association of Dallas-Fort Worth, Drew. Is that it?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. And but he is he and his son Byron formed the Capital Insights team. The other colleague of mine who's here today is Chris Wallace. Chris is the CEO of the North Texas Commission, good partner in our regional chamber coalition. He's the convener and driver of it. Chris was also previously the president of the Texas Association of Business. And way back when, he and I on the same day started as CEOs. He was at the Irving Las Colinas Chamber of Commerce, and I started here at the Richardson Chamber. Obviously, his career has gone way up, and I've just kind of been mired here in Richardson, toiling away, Tech Titans, and all that good stuff. Anyway, we're pleased to provide kind of some insights and recaps on what happened in the legislative session. So I want to start by providing some context of what the session was going to look like, given all the things that have happened over the last 18 months. And I'm going to ask Drew to kind of put the session in context. So Drew, would you go ahead and do that, please?
Oh, you bet. Thanks so much. And I really appreciate being here. And I felt really good about this until I saw that note that said this is recorded. And I thought, whoops, I better change my comments. But anyway, seriously, if you think back 18 months ago when we left the last session of the legislature and what we had done and some of the transformations we'd seen in financing, education, transportation, and those kinds of things, and the economy at the time was taking off and doing quite well. And then we got into the pandemic. And what did the pandemic do to the session itself? First and foremost, we had the controller coming out and telling us we were going to have double-digit deficits, 10 to 15% deficits in the budget. But more importantly to the session itself, the pandemic stopped all of the interim hearings. And interim hearings for those of us who work in the process, that's where a lot of things get fleshed out. That's where stakeholders get to meet with members of the legislature and staff. And you see a lot of legislation get hammered out, if you will, before you actually get to January. And the old axiom in lobbying is that if you show up in January in an odd numbered year looking for help, you're too late, because usually in the interim, that's where a lot of the heavy lifting is done. So we got into the session in January, and basically the Capitol itself was shut down. They hadn't decided on what protocols to use, how to get in. And if you recall, that was just when the vaccine was starting to become available and people were getting vaccinated. There was talk about whether we would have a virtual session of the legislature and what that would look like. Obviously, they moved past that. But as we got into through January, the first 3 weeks of the session, there really wasn't much interaction. And if you, like me, had gotten into the Capitol, you would discover you were very much alone. There wasn't anybody in the Capitol. The halls were empty, and most of the offices to members of the House and Senate and the governor's office, and particularly the lieutenant governor's office, they were locked. You couldn't actually get in to have meetings. The only meetings you could have with your members were virtual. Then we got into February, things started to change a little bit, and then we discovered that they named winter storms. I'd never heard of a winter storm being named before, but Uri hit us. And as I was telling Chris and Bill before, it reminded me very much of what Mike Tyson used to talk about in a boxing match. You know, you have your plan and then you get hit in the mouth. And the storm really caught everybody off guard. And it changed the dynamics of what was important to get done during the session. And subsequently, you had some very heavy duty, weighty issues that had to be addressed, and very few members of the legislature who really had the expertise or understanding of how the power grid worked, how ERCOT worked, where the PUC's responsibilities were, what the RRC's responsibilities were, et cetera. And so that took up a lot of the oxygen out of the room. And then, of course, we had to go ahead and get a budget done and things like that. The good news is that all the predictions, dire predictions about the economy were wrong. We ended up actually with a budget just a little bit smaller than we got 2 years ago, but we got one, and the funding is there. So it really made for a very short window to get any kind of legislation done. So from a practical standpoint, the session started about March 16th. And to frame that, to understand, by May 16th, for all intents and purposes, the session's over. If your business hasn't been heard, introduced, heard, and through the process by about May 16th, very likely it wasn't going to make it. So there are a lot of issues that and some would say they weren't, necessarily all that important to the state, but there are a lot of issues and tweaks and changes never got addressed, and it's because we just flat ran out of time. But inside the confines of that, we still did have a session. We still did have a lot of issues addressed, and from a standpoint of accomplishments, I think there's any number of important things that the legislature got done. And one, though, that we didn't get to address, and that's because of the census, was redistricting. So we definitely are going to have a special session. That is a process that the governor calls the legislature back. The governor actually sets the table for the special session. The governor's office is the only office that can put items eligible on the list for a special session. So regardless of what noise you may hear from other members of the legislature or from the speaker or the lieutenant governor, the only office that will determine what will be decided or worked on during a special session is the governor. So we will be having that in October, and it's very speculative as what else he'll put on the agenda. I know that he's talked about a number of things, but until he does call it, we won't know. But the one thing I can tell you for sure, we will have a special session. It will address redistricting. And very likely that means that our primaries, rather than being in March, will end up being in May, and the runoffs will be in July. So we still have those things that we have to address. But that's kind of a quick snapshot thumbnail overview of the session. But I can tell you that in all my years of participating in and observing the process, I've never seen anything like this, where access to the Capitol was restricted, that we didn't have, if you think about it, we didn't have any of the normal activities that you have during a session, where you have Collin County days, Dallas County days, the Texas Medical Association day at the Capitol, where the doctors are all walking around with their stethoscopes on. I always thought they looked like a BMW or Mercedes-Benz technicians. But anyway, you didn't have any of those kind of things. So there wasn't a lot of interactivity with members of the legislature and their constituents. Secondly, which made it even more of a stilted, if you will, process, was most members of the legislature didn't get apartments. Very often what you discover is that they'll go down there in December, January, before a session starts, they'll rent an apartment. Well, because nobody was there, that didn't happen, which means that most members of the legislature were not spending weekends down there. There was none of this sense of collegiality that was created by being there all the time together and working together. I had one chairman of, well, it's a chairman of one of the bigger committees told me, this was in March, the first week of March, his first committee meeting was to be that week. And I said, well, what do you think of your members of your committee? And he says, I don't know. I haven't met about half of them. Literally had not met them yet, much less knew that they were going to be on his committee. So it made for a very, very different dynamic than we've ever had before. And but again, you know, it worked. We got a balanced budget. Life goes on, and we'll see what happens next.
Sure, I remember the last time that the primaries got delayed. There was a rather significant upset in the runoff election between David Dewhurst and Ted Cruz.
Yes, sir. And Bob Dewell and Bob Hall.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. So some things can happen. Well, so let's focus on the issues here for a moment. And I'm going to share my screen and go through a document that Chris Wallace's group helped put together on behalf of the Regional Chamber Coalition. And Chris, I'd like for you to explain to our group kind of, you know, who the Regional Chamber Coalition is and what its purpose was, and then we'll dive into some of the issues. And we will put a copy of this document in the chat.
You bet. Bill, thank you for having me. Thank you for your leadership in our Regional Chamber Coalition. You have been an excellent, exceptional leader for us and continue to be. And also, let me thank you as chair of the Governor's Broadband Development Council. What you do there was imperative this session, particularly since HB 5 passed. So again, thank you for your leadership. It's always great to share the stage with my friend Drew Campbell. Let me just add one thing to what Drew was saying, because that's probably one of the best recaps or setup, if you will, to this session. You know, despite that we had challenges with COVID recovery, you know, that was obviously a big issue. As Drew said, Winter Storm Uri, that was a big issue, access, you know, et cetera. We were still, the legislature was still able to focus enormous amount of time on red meat issues. And so we're going to go through and talk about some of these issues today. And so, you know, the almost 7,000 bills and just over 1,000 that were passed, many of these are related to critical issues. But there are some that, just a few, that actually dealt with the pandemic recovery or dealt with winterization of the grid and the power plants. And so I hope we'll discuss some of that today as well. Bill wanted me to explain the Regional Chamber Coalition. So there are 102 chambers of commerce in the North Texas region. 9 of them have government relations functions, like the Richardson Chamber. Bill does an enormous amount of work in Austin and in DC. And so with the commission as an association, there's 10 partners. Each 10 break up issues, and we each divide and conquer the top 10 issues of the region. So each chamber will actually manage one issue. The chambers, all 102, voted on the top 10 issues prior to the session well, it was a September prior to the session. And on top of that, we had 38 mayors, including Mayor Velker, who signed a letter of support of these top issues, and to all of our 41 House members and 9 senators who represent our region of 13 counties. And so that's a little bit about the RCC, a great coalition to really unify our strategies and unify our messaging for the entire region. I remember when I was at TAB, we would go to the Capitol and meet with legislators in North Texas with our chamber partners and members, businesses. And oftentimes I heard legislators say, you know, I heard that from your chamber, I heard that from your city or your county, but I'm also hearing from another county or another city or another chamber, something else. And he said, you know, why don't you all go back to North Texas and get on the same page about what you want and what are the top issues of the region, and come and let your legislators know. Well, that's what we've done with these issues here. with our 41 House members and 9 senators. So, Bill, you want to start with public ed? You want me to start with that?
Yep, please do.
Right on top of the list is public education. That was, and these are actually in priority order, voted on by the chambers on what the number one issue is, and that was public ed funding. So sustaining what was landmark legislation from the '86 session to fully fund HB3 and then some. And so we did that this session. Drew had talked about the lack of an interim, and I totally agree with that. But we did manage to meet with either in person or virtually during the interim, all 41 House members and all 9 senators. And without fail, and even the new ones said that this was a top priority of theirs. Obviously, COVID recovery and then later the winter storm, but funding public education, maintaining HB3 level funding was without doubt a priority of all the legislators. So that was very refreshing. So out of SB1, drafted by our own Chairwoman Jane Nelson from our region, Chair of Senate Finance, the $248 billion biennium budget of the state. It's a big chunk of that goes to our public schools. We also saw a cleanup bill, HB 1525, which corrects a lot of aspects of HB3 that were not working. I remember that night on the House floor, and then when it went to the Senate and came back to the House, it was a whole slew of amendments that were tacked on. A lot of those harmful, what we would consider harmful or damaging amendments that our superintendents were engaged with died, thankfully. And so we got a pretty good version of 1525 passed. I want to thank all of you, including Bill and the team at the Richardson Chamber, for helping us to really push a campaign to the top leaders of the state to fund a direct flow of federal stimulus dollars from COVID-19 directly to our schools. The state held that up for a period of time. And we really advocated that our public schools get that direct flow of dollars, and they did get the majority of that, not all of it. And then, of course, the hold harmless that came from students not attending in class in person on daily average attendance, the hold harmless funding. And that was finally approved by the governor. And I think Commissioner Morath was really waiting for that sign off by the governor, and we finally got that. So this package of what was put in the budget for the upcoming biennium, the hold harmless funding and the federal stimulus, I think we're in good shape when it comes to public schools. So this is our future education, obviously, as well as the importance of higher education. And Bill, I think you're going to take higher ed. Bill, thank you for your leadership. Bill actually managed this issue for the Regional Chamber Coalition. And as you all know, and Amanda and others are on the phone, experts, this was supposed to be a higher ed session. And although we didn't fare too bad, we still have a lot of work to do. So Bill, I'll turn it over to you, sir.
Yeah, absolutely. So the higher ed community clearly felt that, this was their turn, that, the public ed community had, gotten some significant achievements in the last session of the legislature. But then this thing called the pandemic hit, the concerns about, state revenues, et cetera. And when the base bills were introduced, it was not what, the higher ed community was hoping for, particularly with respect to one, they didn't restore the 5% budget cuts that had been mandated during the pandemic. And the other was it did not include, any of the dollars needed to fully fund the Texas Research Incentive Program, which is a really big deal, as Amanda will tell you, particularly for UT Dallas and the other emerging research universities. I think the backlog that the state owes those universities is over $200 million. I think UT Dallas is owed some 50 million or so. So, those were not in the base budgets. The other thing that wasn't in there were monies for new campus or campus renovation, capital improvement projects called, sometimes referred to as tuition revenue bonds, a bit of a misnomer because they're really funded by the general revenue of the state. But typically, we try to get, a tuition revenue bond program going every, couple or 3 or 4 sessions. And it's been a while since we've had one. At the end of the day, however, the final budget did include money at least for enrollment growth at the universities. It did include formula funding. It did not, restore the 5% cuts. And the bill that would have provided the pathway for the revenue bonds, House Bill 1530, that was authored by the chairman of House Higher Ed, Jim Murphy, did pass the House, but it never got a hearing in the Senate. And that's just like last session when Representative Chris Turner of Arlington chaired House Higher Ed. He got the tuition revenue bond bill through the House. It never got a hearing in the Senate. So we've got work to do in that regard. The final budget bill did provide some funding for the Texas Research Incentive Program, but 5% less than what they normally would have got in a budget cycle. So I think it was $32.5 million, and no funding of the backlog, unfortunately. So perhaps there's a way to work on that, with the federal stimulus dollars or in a special. There was an interesting bill that would kind of more formalize the tri-agency workforce initiative that is between the Texas Education Agency, the Texas Workforce Commission, and the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board. It was House Bill 3767, also chaired by Representative Jim Murphy of Houston. And the governor is expected to sign that bill, and that'll provide a lot better coordination for all the workforce development programs here in the state. Chris, you want to talk about Skills Development Fund?
Yeah, you bet. Senator Creighton and Representative Parker were leaders in helping us with the TRUE initiative. That's the Texas Reskilling and Upskilling Through Education. We've had that for a short time, but really we saw from the pandemic, this was vitally important. As we looked at workers in terms of current skills, perhaps they were laid off and they are reskilling to start another trade. And so what this TRUE initiative will do in 1102 Senate bill, it'll basically provide a grant program for community colleges. And so they will be offering training that will hopefully is the goal. And we are optimistic about that, for a more productive workforce that is trained to truly meet our industry demands. And so that is the TRUE initiative. The governor is expected to sign that. There were not a lot of discussion on the House or Senate floor about that. You might recall, Amanda, or Bill, what was it? Was the 60 by 30, was it 2 sessions ago when that was?
I think it was 3 sessions ago.
3 sessions ago. So the 60 by 30, that's 60% of Texans, what is it, Bill, between 24 and 32?
18 and 32 that have to have a certificate or a degree by 2030.
Yeah, 2 or 4 year degree by 2030. And so, we still got a lot of work to do. And so hopefully this TRUE initiative funding will help in one part of it. So that's a little bit about our skills development.
And then Drew, a major initiative particularly for economic development and for a lot of the manufacturers in the state was to get reauthorization of what's called Chapter 313. I know that you worked that. Can you talk about the dynamics that led to the outcome and what's the importance of this renewal? And by the way, your audio is off.
Sorry about that. Thank you. Yeah, this is one of the issues that I think demonstrates really demonstrates what happens when you don't have the opportunity and time to work through the process. I think that everybody in economic development, they all recognize the importance of Chapter 313, but there were a number of issues that have come up about the implementation of it, and some of the businesses, some members of the Senate in particular felt like that some of the businesses had not lived up to their agreements, and there was a feeling that there was some tweaks that needed to be made to the chapter itself. And basically, this one just sort of ran out of time before we could get the finished product done. But I've been assured by the Speaker's office, the Governor's office, and a number of members of our delegation that they realize the importance of this, but they also realize the importance that some of these things need to be changed, amended, and improved as we work through the process. And I think that it's important to recognize that a lot of times we think about the really big projects like Tesla coming to Texas or Toyota bringing their manufacturing plants. We see all those kinds of really big projects, and we think that's where Chapter 313 really comes through for us. But it's not just the big namesake, it's also all the suppliers that come along with them. There's any number of ripple effects that this chapter has in terms of economic development. But I've been assured that everyone recognizes the fact that it is important. And you may have seen as we got towards the end of the session that former Governor Perry had actually stepped in and began to voice his support and concern over the fact that we weren't going to renew it. But I have every reason to believe that our leadership recognizes the need to make sure that we extend this.
Just so the audience will realize what this is, it's a means by which a school district can limit the property taxes that a significant new manufacturing plant or others would pay. They still have to pay school property taxes, but it puts a limitation on how much they pay over about a 10-year period of time. There's a negotiation in terms of payment in lieu of taxes, a whole bunch of other things. It's a very complicated process. And Chairman Murphy tried to, reform that process. And I think to Drew's point, that's where, interim hearings would have really been helpful. When that bill hit the floor of the House, he was getting hit from the left and right with amendments that just would have, torpedoed the program. And so he ditched his own bill. He pulled it and said, we're just not going to take it up. And then the extension bill, the simple extension, failed to get, heard in the Senate after it passed the House. So there's a lot of work to do. So we've used this twice in Richardson. The Plano School District provided a 313, value limitation, it's called, to Texas Instruments on both phase one of their project up on Renner Road and the phase two. Chris, I know a huge amount of effort was put into trying to reduce the number of uninsured Texans by taking advantage of some of the federal, monies that are available under the ACA and Medicaid expansion. I know the commission put a lot of effort into this. Would you talk about that, please?
Yeah, you bet. Unfortunately, Texas is number one, and it's not just because we're the largest state in terms of our population, but we're number one of uninsured citizens. And so we attempted to try to change that. We thought that really all the stars were aligning because of the COVID pandemic, really focus on healthcare for everybody and the importance of that. And also the waiver 1115, which is so important to our hospital systems. That was expiring, it had to be renewed. And so we thought all the stars were aligning prior to session starting. We didn't get there. And, there's a lot of debate on why and why not. But we probably, and Bill and Drew have been doing this a lot longer than me. I think this is my 10th session, but I think out of, in terms of my history, this is probably the farthest that we have gotten in terms of a bipartisan discussion from both the Senate and the House. We did see a Live Well Texas package of bills, one by Senator Nathan Johnson right here from our area, 117, and then Julie Johnson, also from our area, Representative Johnson, 387. Those bills, companion bills, did move forward in a bipartisan effort, but unfortunately, they were never given a hearing. But there's a lot of discussion about them, and the discussion really came in the form of an amendment during the budget process. And we really thought that, particularly when the current administration had announced that they were rescinding the decision of the previous administration on the renewal of the waiver 1115. And ends up that was due to some procedural errors, and the state is working to correct that now. We really do believe that we're going to get that renewal of the 1115 back, which is going to help in terms of our hospitals for uncompensated care. But we really thought that we had a chance, more so than in a long time, on Medicaid expansion. We did see one piece of if you want to call it Medicaid expansion, for mothers that gave birth. They are now, if they're on Medicaid, they are now extended from 2 months to 6 months. And so that is expected to be signed by the governor. And that was a priority of our new speaker. Speaker Phelan made that a top priority. So we saw some segment of our population expanded in terms of Medicaid, but not broadly that we certainly hoped for.
I think this is another example of an issue that really needs some interim work. It's a very big, complicated issue. It also one that I think a lot of members need to be educated about. One of the other aspects of this issue that gets lost sometimes is the economic development that it provides for our rural communities who really need this help to keep their hospitals open and provide health care for people out in the rural areas. And so I don't think this issue is quote unquote going to go away. It's one that you're gonna see, I think Senator Johnson aggressively go after it again and work with the governor to make some significant changes to this.
Absolutely. Well said, Drew. Senator Johnson has really become an expert on this issue. And a Republican leader in the House that we were talking to probably said it best early on, and then there was a lot of tweeting about it, and that is, this is recapturing. This is recapturing our dollars. These are Texas tax dollars that we all send to DC, and we're just asking to get it back to our state. So right now they go to 38 other states. Our tax dollars are going to 38 other states because we don't have a plan to recapture our dollars for Medicaid. So until we come up with our own plan, and what is that plan? No different than what we're doing on broadband planning and others to capture federal dollars. So we've got to do the same here. And hopefully Drew is correct that this will be studied this next interim.
It makes so much business sense. I think all the big business organizations in the state are for it. They get, the need to reduce the number of uninsured Texans. The federal dollars are enormous that would flow to the state, really help relieve a lot of budget pressures, but it's going to take some work. So Chris, we had another dynamic that was kind of shades of the bathroom bill a few years ago happen, and you want to talk about particularly SB 29?
Yeah, I haven't regrown all my hair yet from that bathroom bill session, but luckily it wasn't near that bad this session. It probably could have been. We really pushed for 3860 by Jessica Gonzalez. That is a comprehensive non-discrimination bill that would protect LGBTQ individuals. It's not only good for LGBTQ individuals, but it's good for the state in terms of business recruitment of top talent, and just to let all companies and events, producers, et cetera, know that we are truly open for business. Unfortunately, that did not get a hearing. And we saw a whole host of bills filed against LGBTQ, particularly transgendered individuals. And again, this certainly would have impacted us from an economic development standpoint. Luckily, SB 29 died. It passed the Senate with no issues. It ultimately, when it was first heard in public ed, Chairman Dutton, it actually failed. And there was some dynamics there. And then it was brought back and it was passed, but it ultimately died on the House floor just due to calendars and the timing of it. And then there's a similar bill, 4042, that was heard in the House and was left pending in committee. So luckily, we did not see any of the 30 plus bills that would impact the LGBTQ community pass. Probably the first session in several that at least one did not pass, and that's a good thing. So we're open and accepting to all in our state, as we should be, right? Good for
Absolutely.
business. Good for business.
Absolutely. Well, Drew, you spent a lot of time on transportation funding. What happened with the transportation funding bills this session?
Well, the good news is that we were fully funded in the budget. There were no diversions, and I will say transportation funding came out quite well. I'm happy to report to you that House Bill 2219, which reauthorizes the Texas Mobility Fund to go forward and do bonding through TxDOT, is on the governor's desk, and we're urging him to sign it. Now, for context, the Texas Mobility Fund was created in 2001. In 2015, there was legislation that was passed that curtailed their ability to issue any more obligation bonds. This legislation will take us right back to where we were in 2001, which, by the way, was a referendum and got almost 75% of the voters in Texas to approve it. The one caveat is that you can't use any of these funds for a tolling project. One of the other important pieces of transportation legislation was HJR 99. And this authorizes the county to finance development or redevelopment of transportation or infrastructure with bonds and notes. This is something that will provide for opportunities at the local level for them to develop funds to start projects, pay for projects. Again, I shouldn't say unfortunately, but at the very end of the session, there was an amendment that was put on HJR 99 that would preclude these dollars from being raised and used for toll projects. But the good news is that we're fully funded and that we've got a couple of new tools in the toolbox, and we're going to be able to hopefully continue to make progress in providing transportation for the people of Texas.
While you kind of got the floor, Drew, why don't we jump down to the eminent domain bills and, what would have happened there, had they passed, et cetera?
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. There were 8 pieces of legislation that were introduced that were set up really to hinder and or stop the high-speed rail project. And basically what most of these bills do is they would cause private investors to look and say, you know what, you're creating too many impediments to us continuing with the project. Through our coalitions, through groups like yours and the Dallas groups and the NTC and Dallas Regional Mobility Coalition and our counterparts in Houston, we were able to make sure that none of these bills made it out of committee. We had one attempt on the floor of the House to put an amendment on a bill, which we were able to successfully keep back. But I would like to tell you all what an important role that Chairman Joe Desotel played in helping us keep the project alive, and also Congresswoman Eddie Bernice Johnson. She was instrumental in helping us garner support against these actions. Within a matter of about 15 minutes of a phone conversation she had with us, she was on the phone personally calling members of the legislature, imploring them to support our efforts to make sure this project goes forward. So the important thing to keep in mind is that the legislature doesn't need to do anything for high-speed rail. The high-speed rail project will happen all on its own without the legislature doing anything. And basically what this is, these are groups of people who don't want the project coming through their property, and or they don't want to have a project like that built because they're afraid that if we get this first leg built, we might really like it and we might want to build new or extend the high-speed rail project. But the good news is that we were able to thwart the attacks, and the project will go forward.
Very good. Chris, a lot of our municipal and county partners were very concerned about efforts to limit what's called taxpayer-funded lobbying. You took a big lead on this. You want to talk about those issues? What happened?
Yeah, you bet. Luckily, both died. And unlike last session, we did see a pretty reasonable committee substitute from Chairman Chris Patty in House State Affairs, really at the kind of the 11th hour. It never made it out of the House State Affairs. We were pretty close to our votes and staying close to every committee member, and really held our votes. We were thinking that Representative Middleton may offer some concessions That did not happen, thankfully, and the votes remained strong. Unfortunately, SB 10 over in the Senate did move forward out of the Senate over into the House, and then Chairman Patty added a committee sub to SB 10. The committee sub would have provided more transparency, but it still would allow for third-party lobbyists to be used by cities, counties. Everybody was affected in the committee sub, with the exception of public schools, K through 12, and hospitals. And so really what they did is they threw the whole kitchen sink of what was provided in HB 749 in Middleton's original bill. And out of various hearings that went until about 5 in the morning, I think Chairman Patty did a really good job of capturing all of the testimony and really tried to negotiate with the committee sub on something that was reasonable and that we could live with. But regardless, this whole business of taxpayer-funded lobbying and stifling our local government's ability to have voices in Austin, and the way they do that efficiently is bad public policy. And so we're very thankful that both failed.
One of the other bills that a lot of municipalities were very concerned about, I know my city, Richardson, opposed this, was House Bill 4072. You want to talk about that for a moment, Chris?
Remind me, 3072, Bill.
4072 is the one that would have changed the tax.
4072, sure, yeah. So, some cities it would benefit, some cities it would not benefit. Basically, 4072 would have required that local sales taxes be collected based on where an item is shipped to, rather than where the order is produced or where the item is sold. And so this actually died in the calendars committee, I believe, in the House. It never got out of calendars, but it would have benefited some cities. It really, really hurt those cities that would have hurt. It would have hurt, it really extremely hurt because they are dependent on that. So, our hope is, and this is going to come back next session. Our hope is, again, in the interim that we'll have, is to really fine tune this, really look at the impact, particularly to those cities that it's really going to hurt, and how we can deal with that. Is that a grandfathering over a certain period of time? But I do think it's coming. There was a similar effort by the comptroller during the interim. And I know Jay Nelson and several legislators from our region stepped in and said, we really need to look at this in the remainder of the interim. And then the winter storm hit. And then, of course, they did take it up in the session. But yeah, 4072 did not make it out of the calendars committee.
Yeah, just to give a sense of the order of magnitude of what we're talking about, the effect, and Jennifer Justice, pay attention to what I'm about to say here. The city of Richardson would have lost about $6 million in sales tax generated general revenue. The city of Campbell, Texas, would have lost $24 million
Huge. In
sales tax general revenue. That's an enormous, unrecoverable hit to a municipal budget, just unrecoverable. So,
a lot of this is predicated from probably some bad 380 agreements. Not all are bad, obviously. They're very helpful tools, but there have been a few struck within the state, not within our region, that are probably not favorable to the state. But under the statute, the comptroller does have the means to go in and correct those single agreements. And so we were strongly recommending that he do that rather than a one-size-fits-all broad approach. As Bill stated, would have been very impactful to many cities, and some cities it would have helped ultimately as well.
So
Bill,
finally,
real quick, Bill, I was just going to point out two things on the HB 749 on taxpayer-funded lobbying. Is that one is that Chris Patty is a former mayor, so he's very sensitive to and listens to his mayors and their concerns. So we're very fortunate that he was chairman of the State Affairs Committee. But in what I would call a very cynical, ironic, but amusing note, as we were awaiting HB 749 to make it to the floor, we all received a save the date email. So it was about saving the date for a fundraiser for certain members of the legislature that were going to take place after the session was over. All the while, all of us who are in the lobby business are waiting to see if our business was going to be banned or not. So it was one of those ironic moments where you're just, you can't make this stuff up.
I thought it was pretty funny. I thought it was pretty funny when Chairman Patty on the House floor late said that he was postponing it till a date in the fall, which is the birth date of Representative Middleton, as well as the speaker. He kind of glanced up at the speaker.
I'll never forget September 18th. I can promise you that.
Yeah. One of the bright spots of the session was the passage of House Bill 5, which was the bill, the broadband bill. It was the first emergency item the governor declared in his State of the State address. The House and Senate both passed their versions of this bill unanimously, which is almost unprecedented. Both bills would have established a broadband office. And the key difference between the House and the Senate is that the House would have put the office under the controller. The Senate would have put it under the University of Texas system. Both bills establish or require the development of a statewide broadband plan that would have regional characteristics, that would understand, what is needed to extend broadband to unserved areas in Texas versus West Texas versus South Texas.
See this?
Also look at.
I kept seeing stuff like this.
We got somebody who's.
Anemia approves poor outcomes of COVID-19.
Need somebody to mute, please.
Or
there we go. Got that taken care of. Both bills would require that plan to be developed within 12 months. Both bills would have established a statewide broadband plan or a program with funds to help cover the gaps in what it's not available through, say, the Federal Communications Commission or other of the many broadband funds out of DC. And importantly, it would require detailed mapping to show where we have gaps in coverage that is much more accurate than what is currently being done. The bill went to conference committee. At the end of the day, they agreed to put the office under the comptroller with a 10-member, I think, gubernatorially appointed advisory board overseeing the office, and the governor is expected to sign the bill. So that's a good thing. I want to end with Drew talking about the winter storm bills and kind of where we go from here. So Drew, and I'm going to stop sharing the document and then post a copy of it in chat for everybody. Drew?
Yes, sir. Basically, what we saw happen right after the winter storm was they immediately, both the House and the Senate immediately went into having hearings, and these were hearings that went way into the middle of the night, day after day after day. And I know that most members of the legislature were, like all of us, caught short. Any number of the members of the legislature were not part of the legislature when this happened back in 2011. And I know that I called my friend Byron Cook here in Corsicana and said, what happened then? And how did this happen? And he said, basically back then they came to some of the same conclusions. They made some recommendations, but there wasn't any follow through. And if you look at the history, it seems like about every 10 to 12 years, something like this happens. Subsequently, I think that any number of the members decided that particularly Senator Kelly Hancock and Representative Chris Patty, they both felt like that they wanted to do something permanent, they want to do something meaningful, and they wanted to go forward with some pretty big bills. And basically, we ended up with SB3, which reorganized how we manage the power grid. And these are big, complicated issues. And I'm not going to try to make you all believe that I completely understand everything that they have done. But Chris put out Patty put out a really good piece called ERCOT reform, and it goes through the bills, what they do. SB2 was about reforming ERCOT and how they go about being managed, and then there were any number of other bills that were presented and passed. The point, though, I think of all of this is that the legislature, the members that I've visited with, they've got the message. They realize that this is not a one-time fix. They know that there are other things that they're going to have to continue to address and that are going to continue to come forward so that we can make sure that this doesn't happen again. Because part of the economic miracle that we enjoy is the foundation that has been laid on our infrastructure, schools, water, et cetera. And this is one of those moments where you're kind of caught short, and you realize that, you know, for all of the great things that Texas is, this was a failure. It was a cataclysmic failure. And they recognize that and realize that. And if we're going to continue to compete to get manufacturing and the likes of Tesla, Toyota, et cetera, to come to Texas, we're going to have to address these issues. And they're very complicated, particularly when you look at the fact that 10 years ago, or back in 2011, which is 10 years ago, the what we call green energy didn't play as big a part or was as big a component of our energy source. And we've got to integrate that into the system, but we've got to do it in such a fashion that we protect the system and make sure that when a Texan turns the lights on, the lights actually come on. So don't be surprised if you don't see some issues relating to the power grid end up in the special session call that's going to come this fall. But like I say, I'll be happy to, Bill, send this to you so you can share it with everybody. It's a pretty good outline of all the things that took place. And again, it comes from Chairman Patty. But if you get a chance and you talk to Chris, Patty, and or Kelly Hancock, a real thank you is due to both these guys, because they spent endless hours learning, studying, and trying to come up with things that will reform the process, but also guarantee, as I said, that when we turn our lights on, flip that switch, the lights actually come on. But it's an ongoing process. It's not something that the legislature is just going to say, hey, we fixed that. And they know that this time.
Right, right. So we've got about 5 minutes left. If anybody wants to ask a question, just go ahead and post it in chat. Or, you know, if you want to unmute and just ask your question, feel free to go ahead and do so. Anybody got a question or a comment? I know this is an audience that doesn't lack for opinions. Anybody have a question? By the way, if you're go ahead, Mary.
Bill, I have a question. And this is probably a pretty simple question, but I've forgotten up at the municipal level, like how soon will we see us looking at that here in Richardson?
I'm sorry, how soon will we look at what?
Well, you know, the state's going to be looking at redistricting.
Right.
Probably in the special session. It looks like it's very likely, according to what I heard today. So that being said, how does that trickle down to the municipalities?
Right. Well, actually, so the City Plan Commission is charged with redrawing the municipal boundaries in Richardson, and they will take that up. Don Magner, I know that you're on the line. Do you know when the City Plan Commission will take up redistricting here in Richardson?
Yeah, Bill, good afternoon to everyone. Likely the start of 2022, the council will officially appoint the CPC as the commission, and then the first election cycle that our new district boundaries would be effective in would be the May 2023 election.
Okay. Drew, there was something else I wanted to ask you about. So I know that, we're going to have a special on redistricting, probably October, maybe something like that. The governor said he will add to the call for a special session, the 16 billion in state, COVID relief dollars and how that gets spent. So really, I've got two questions. One is, what would those $16 billion go for potentially? And the second one is, how likely is he going to follow through with his threat to defund the legislature?
I'll take the first one. The $16 billion. First, there are federal guidelines as to what and how they can spend those dollars. Those guidelines are a lot more broad than the ones that were issued last fall when we got the first tranche of money. And I think that he'll have, or the legislature will have, really pretty great discretion about how they're going to spend those dollars. I know that some of the talk amongst the appropriators is they're looking for one-time investments that they can make in terms of infrastructures, particularly as it comes to communications and things like that. Now, as to defunding the legislature, I think that's something you'd have to ask the governor himself. I think that was as much about a reaction to the walkout as anything else. And I think that if you look at some of the publications and interviews that the speaker has done since the end of the session, I think that's a more balanced approach to what happened and why it happened.
Amanda Rocco, would the funding the backlog of TRIP dollars be something that some of that 16 billion could go for?
It sure would. Thanks for that great idea.
So
Yeah,
Della Bryant, Della, I see you're taking notes. I want you to take a note down. Fund the backlog of TRIP dollars with the 16 billion.
Right. It impacts 8 schools. I mean, you couldn't find anything better. Austin, say that to Angie too. Although I know both Angie and Angela say TRIP anytime they see an appropriator. They're like, they've been scared into it, I guess. I bug them so much. I think the interesting thing is that if he follows through with defunding the legislature, that means the first special will be in August, right? Because the legislature's funded through the end of the fiscal year and not for the next fiscal year. So hopefully that would mean that, it all gets fixed by the time the next fiscal year starts.
And that also means I wouldn't have a job, so therefore I couldn't answer about the TRIP dollars.
Right.
The one thing, Drew, you kind of alluded to that, contextualize this session, and certainly is contextualizing a lot of the issues and the special session items. We've got a primary coming up next year. And that's, and then we're going to have another session starting in 14 months. Think that had any effect on what happened during the legislative session?
Yes, obviously it does. And everybody talks about the red meat issues and those kinds of things. But yeah, we're 565 days away from the next session of the legislature. And, we're less than 8 months away from the primaries, if the primaries are in March. So obviously it does. But the flip side of that, I'd suggest to you, is that for most of the electorate, they didn't pay that much attention to what was going on in Austin. And I'm not sure that very many of them remember about the winter storm Uri. I mean, we live in such a compartmentalized world anymore. But I think that's right. And who knows what can happen between now and October that may come up as a political issue that the governor will feel compelled to put on the special call. And what I would leave you all with this is that when the session ended in 2019, We were looking for clear sailing. We had the economy was on a roll. We knew we had a presidential election in front of us. But I mean, you know, when you think about all of the things that happened between June of 2019 and January of 2021, I mean, it really boggles the mind. And we can make our predictions today about what we think are going to be the issues. And the reality is we don't know what they're going to be. There's so many things that can happen. All the political upheaval from the presidential election to the January 6th incident to, you know, the pandemic and et cetera. I mean, it really is very tumultuous, and we live in those times. And sometimes when you look at some of these cultural issues or quote unquote red meat issues, you're left with a feeling that, hey, you know, there are a lot of other things that the Texas legislature could be looking at. And I think that hopefully in this interim, we actually have committee meetings. We actually delve into some of these really big, what I call weighty issues, like Medicaid expansion. And you know, I'll throw this out there as an aside. We live now with 5 states, our contiguous states to it are in some level or way have legalized marijuana and the use thereof, and have put into place regulatory schemes to do that. They've decriminalized it, et cetera. And now the country of Mexico is on the threshold of doing the same. And we have done nothing to prepare for it. You know, when you think about how big this marketplace is with 30 million people in it, et cetera, and there's no regulatory scheme in place at all for this. And so there are some big, heavy, weighty issues that I think need to be really, really worked out, thrashed out, and we need to be prepared to hit the ground running in 2023.
None too soon to start some interim hearings.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Gentlemen, thank you so much. You're just a fountain of wisdom and knowledge and guidance. As a reminder for everybody, I did put the document that Chris Wallace's group assembled through the Regional Chamber Coalition in the chat, so you can open that up and save it. We'll be sending that out soon. Chris, you want to talk about the scorecard real quick and when we're going to do that?
You bet. Thanks, Bill. We are producing again an accountability index, which is basically a record of final votes. This one's going to look a little different because it's not all going to be third reading votes. Not all of our parties got a third reading, but a final vote, whether it's a committee or maybe an amendment. But if you look at those top 10 priorities voted on by the chambers, we will be producing a record vote, a final vote for you all to have. And so we hope you'll use that in your decision making in terms of funding to contributions to legislators, when you're meeting with legislators on how they voted on the top priorities of our region, how we fared. So it's not so much a score, but it is a record. It's just a convenience. Basically, you can go look it up yourself, obviously, but we'll do it for you and put it in a good resource, and you can have that moving forward. So we'll have that done here probably the next 30 to 45 days.
I would also be remiss if I didn't thank the leadership of the Chamber and Tech Titans advocacy efforts. You know, Randy Ford with National Right Your Congressman, Liz Morse with the Richardson School District, Barbara Baffer with Erickson for Tech Titans. Thank you, Barbara. Matt Foster, I see you there with AT&T, and Virginia Schaefer with Texas Instruments. So thanks to all my great leaders. Thanks again. By the way, you should all join the North Texas Commission, and y'all ought to hire Drew Campbell as your own personal lobbyist.
Okay, it's time to go.
I second that.
Y'all have a great day. We're adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good weekend.
Everybody have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.
Thank you and goodbye.